Hey, UConn students. Hope you're hanging in there, doing well. Couple nice days here today. Hopefully tomorrow will be nice too. I've heard from most of you as far as the responding yes to my question about Google Classroom and your engagement and things like that. If you would please reach out to text your friends and make sure that they've done that because there's a list of names that I have to already forwarded actually. But anyways, what I want to do is just keep up with what we're doing here. A week from Friday, your paper will be due, and just to continue on with that process, I've been trying to do these little discussions to help you with that, and posting some things online that will help you answer the prompt. So today, I want to continue with the discussion on African Americans in terms of having a voice. So we looked at the 1920s and in World War I in that era, and we certainly had the beginnings of the rise of the KKK, the Great Migration, some of those things that happened as African Americans begin to experience this discrimination in what they thought was kind of a safe place, which was the North, which was anything but that in many ways as far as discrimination goes. Perhaps you didn't see the extreme violence that you saw on a regular basis in the South, but there was certainly a good deal of discrimination that was going on here. The first issue that I want to deal with, before I get into it, the other thing is I will post on our stream to remind you that we have issues and activities, or issues and controversies, excuse me, that you have a link to right on our Google Classroom page. And it talks about all the civil rights issues that you'll see, the links I give you or the hard copies I give you in class to do our Socratic circles on. So look at those activities in terms of the civil rights things that I'm going to share with you. I'm just going to give you an overview, and you can go there for kind of a deeper understanding. If you have any specific content questions, okay, feel free to just email me, ask me. I'm happy to respond. Um, but the first one that comes up right away is the desegregation of the armed forces. Now, World War II, you had an uptick in the number of African American soldiers that were involved there, and studies that were done kind of suggested it was a successful and positive thing for African American soldiers to fight along with their white counterparts. And in 1945, you have the war end, and you have everybody come home, and so the question comes up as Truman, is the president now, what to do about the armed forces? Should they be desegregated? So when I was a high school student, I used to get segregated and desegregated confused. Segregated is the way society was. It was separated by races. If you desegregate it, it means you bring them together. A positive term is integration, okay, is a way to say it. But desegregation was the idea of making sure that these units weren't segregated, but rather were together. Now, there were some issues that came up right away. There was obviously a lot of people that didn't want to see this happen. So they would say that what this would do is destroy the morale of the troops. They would say things that it would destroy the effectiveness of the troops because it would dismantle and disrupt a situation that had been there for so long. And in a real discriminatory argument that was made was that the African American soldier was naturally more cowardly. Well, one of the reasons for that might be because of their place that they were kept in society and discriminated against. They may have used that as evidence to say that they were more cowardly, which is ridiculous. But that was one of the arguments that was made. Um, and those that argued for desegregation was this idea that it was so hypocritical for us to argue that we were fighting for freedom in the other parts of the world, and yet we segregated our society. Also when you went into other areas and you were, if you could desegregate your armed forces, it would give you moral authority in foreign countries to talk to the populations about equality and some of those things. Hitler actually was on record um, giving the United States of America kudos for the way that they dealt with their minorities. It's not a compliment that you want, right? So as the as the Holocaust became evident to us, and we began to go to the death camps, and we saw what that type of thinking can lead to. It kind of caused a lot of people to re-examine some of our racial assumptions in this country. Um, so desegregation happened, um, but it took about 3 years for this actually to take place. So what ends up happening is we actually get involved in another conflict, the Korean War, which was actually not a declared war; it was a UN police action. Um, but because we needed, more soldiers, and the studies came out that showed that this was an effective thing. Now integration begins to happen between 1948 and 1950 in the armed forces, and each branch kind of went about it differently. But the Korean War is important because it's really the first conflict that we fight where we have, at least on paper, an integration that occurs between our races. So people kind of lose sight of that with the Korean War. It's already called our Forgotten War. Um, but one of the things that was certainly forgotten is maybe it was our first war, where you actually had an integration of the armed forces. That doesn't mean, though, that there wasn't discrimination. I mean, I've done enough research on the Vietnam War to know that even during the Vietnam War, there was a tremendous amount of institutional discrimination against African American soldiers. So on the one hand, they were treated subpar in our society, but when it came to fighting, they were put on the front lines, and many times kept to themselves. Just because things are desegregated doesn't mean that white and black soldiers are going to choose to live that way. They're so used to being segregated that their de facto mode, is going to be to kind of do that to themselves. And so that was something they fought against. I read a book on the African American soldier called Bloods, which was really good. So if you're interested in more of that kind of topic, go check it out. So the next thing that comes up is Brown versus the Board of Ed. So as we see the armed forces desegregate, now the question comes up about schools. Let's desegregate the schools. So if you remember, Plessy versus Ferguson in the late 19th century argued that separate could be equal, that as long as things were equal, you could keep races separate. Well, one of the things that the forces now argue, concerning why we should desegregate the schools, Brown, for instance, had to travel. She lived right near a school, but yet, according to the way the law worked, was that she had to travel an awful, a long distance to attend an all African American school. And so this ends up going to the Supreme Court, which brings it front and center. And one of the constitutional arguments for desegregating the school is that it was a violation of the 14th Amendment, which was equal protection. So if you are, if you're segregating your society, are both races really being protected equally? We know now that that's a joke to think that that was actually true, but that was one of the arguments that was made. And then they did, studies. This is where psychology kind of began to play a large role in our society. Even raising children at this time, people begin to look at like Dr. Benjamin Spock and some other studies where they looked at what this did to African American children. And the segregation process actually, the study showed, made them feel inferior about themselves. And you didn't have to look very far to see that the separate was there, but the equal was not. If you just looked at the conditions of the African American schools in the South, especially, you're looking at night and day compared to where the money actually went. And remember, if most of your local political leaders are white and they have to figure out where money is going to be spent, it's not too hard to imagine where that money is going to go first. So these were some of the things that was argued on the side of desegregation in Brown versus the Board of Ed. Judicial review was necessary to get involved to end this. Now, those that would argue against segregation, okay, or against desegregation, against the federal government and the Supreme Court ruling that we needed to desegregate our schools, they argued that as long as it was separate, as the Supreme Court ruled, it was equal, and that's the end of the discussion. And they also argued that this was a state matter, that this is not in the federal constitution. Even today, if you look in our Constitution, there's no mention of public education there, but there are mentions of things like the 14th Amendment, equal protection, um, and things like that. So while it wasn't being argued in terms of our Constitution for public education, it was being argued on the grounds of equal protection. So, but the big pushback comes in with the states and their power and their responsibility. Think of what's going on right now with our federal government responding to questions concerning ventilators and things like that to get them to the state governments. Well, it's federalism. And what is the federal role here? And then what is the state role? What's the federal responsibility? What's the state responsibility? That's going to be an ongoing conversation over the next several months. Some people are wanting a national stay-at-home order. Some governors are not doing that at all. They're actually, I think I just heard today that the governor of Georgia opened a beach or something like that there. Um, but with could the president issue a national order? Probably. Would everybody be happy about that? No. And so these forces are going to be pushing against each other over the last several months, and that's right at the heart of what happened in Brown. Okay, so what ends up happening is the once Brown is established and it's given the Supreme Court rules that the schools need to be desegregated. Now the state steps in and starts manipulating this process. Teachers are fired that would work with African American students. Some schools are closed outright. There's a resurgence in the KKK in parts of the South. And then what you eventually have here is a major confrontation in Little Rock, Arkansas, the Little Rock Nine, where the other thing is the states start to argue that while the Supreme Court ruled that, it's up to them to figure out how quickly they desegregate the schools. Well, you know enough about history to know that this is a nice way to say we're going to take our time. It might take us 3 or 4 decades. Right? You can just imagine the amount of shenanigans that would go on here. So the Little Rock Nine basically attempt to enter Little Rock High School. There's a lot of, they're blocked. The path is blocked. And eventually, President Eisenhower is called on to act, and he sends in federal troops. So this is a major scene in our country. You can find videos. They just came out with some other. I don't know if they were always with us, but there's some new unique videos that showed the students walking to school and what that was like to see armed soldiers there. And what ends up happening is those federal soldiers are replaced by the National Guard. And so it's one thing to get the students into the school. It's another thing to have them successfully implemented into classes and things like that. So the guards actually walk with them in the halls, but they're picked on. They're nasty things are said about them. The teachers do little to nothing to kind of step up and do something to protect them. So even though we hear this great victory where the federal troops are in, the rest of the year is very, very hard. And then what you have in 58 and 59 is you actually have the school closed because they take the jurisdiction. It's not safe to open it, they say, because of all the issues that are involved. And then eventually, by an executive order, they're forced to open. Businesses are being impacted by the national attention that's happening there. So eventually, we see a desegregation. But there were other places too. At the University of Mississippi, riots broke out when James Meredith was, where desegregation happened there. A guy named James Meredith wanted to go to school there, to the point where President Kennedy had to send in the army to force, not in Mississippi but in Alabama, Governor Wallace to force desegregation of the University of Alabama. So going back to Mississippi, where Meredith went to school to desegregate there, 2 people ended up dead after a bunch of riots. In Alabama, Wallace, stood up to the federal government and all the rest of it, but the troops come in and force the issue. Wallace goes on to become a third-party candidate, and actually, I believe he was the most successful third-party candidate to run for president, which would have been 68, I believe. Um, I think it was 68. And he ran for president until Ross Perot. So it shows you the amount of support that a guy like Wallace had, and certainly carried the South in terms of being a segregationist. Um, and then, it's important to look at what Eisenhower did. I think it gets overlooked a little bit because he chose to act. You can go back to Truman with the desegregation. Those presidents set a precedent. If they had not done that, you could only guess how long this might have taken to actually happen. What would life be like today if Eisenhower did not send those federal troops in? And then finally, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is passed. So by 64, remember, Kennedy had been assassinated and Johnson is the president. And that made it illegal to discriminate on the grounds of race, religion, or gender. So that now applies to libraries, restaurants, all of those things. And again, the argument starts, that this is wrong. It should be up to the states. They have a right to associate with whoever they want. That's constitutional. Segregation maintains harmony, and that putting quotas with hiring practices and things like affirmative action types of things creates discrimination in reverse. And then the other side just argued this is equal protection again. And clearly, this separate but equal, leaving it up to the states, this hasn't worked. Just look at your states. Look who's in charge. Look who has management positions. Look who's in politics. You could go on and on. And so the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is a big step in the direction that we see of successful civil rights legislation that happens. Civil Rights Act of 1964 says nothing about voting. That's going to come a year later. So you have these forces clashing, with this topic. And just so you think this was something that happened, 50 years ago or more, it still goes on, like Sheff versus O'Neill, as a federal Supreme Court case, and even in Connecticut, if communities willfully segregate themselves by race, and the school is predominantly one race because of where people have chosen to live, or the argument gets a little dicey. Maybe their choices were limited because of ongoing discrimination. Should that school be forcefully desegregated? There's schools in Hartford, for instance, that are certain races, like overwhelmingly so. Should those schools be broken up and forced busing and things like that? It's pretty controversial today concerning how that should happen. So those are just some issues. Think about in our unit and the question having a voice. Left just to ourselves, we had obviously the freedom of the slaves, the freedmen. We have those Reconstruction Acts that happen. But by the time you get to the early 1960s, post World War II, you see that there is a lot of segregation, a lot of discrimination that has not gone away and is deeply entrenched still. And so as you think about writing your essay in terms of successes and failures, clearly we had some successes legislatively, but we had pushback, right, from the states and from people that don't want this to go forward in a real clean way. They want to use as much of their power to stop this as possible. And they would dress these arguments up to make them sound nice. You had a resurgence of the KKK. They talked about orderly society, that maybe this is the right thing to do, but not the right time to do it. And so as the 60s kind of move on, we get involved in a war in Vietnam that becomes very unpopular. People begin to look at the inherent tensions that we have in this country and say, well, why are we going to a country on the other side of the world to combat what we look there as injustices, and we have so much of it here? So our nation kind of blows up in 1968. It culminates there, and and so that's where we really look at civil rights, and we'll talk about it, but some of the deaths and things like that occur. Even by this time, we'll talk about it in the next session, but Malcolm X was an early civil rights activist who meets a rough end. So that is already starting. You've got all sorts of terrible things that are happening to African Americans and whites who stand up for them throughout the South and other parts of our country. Um, Somebody asked a good question about your essay, whether it was actually Gianna. So I'm going to give you a shout out, Gianna. Well done. Um, that she asked, is it either or? It was success or failures, or is it a combination? For this one, I'd rather see you do a combination because I think it's accurate. You certainly, in some cases, I would have you argue one way or the other, but a combination is more historically accurate here, and kind of describe some of the strengths that you see and some of the weaknesses. So going back on your syllabus with all the readings you've done, create a little outline for yourself and talk about pros and cons, and it's also, again, the tone of your essay can be what your opinion is. Um, you know, it's hard for us because we can't go back in time to know how big of a change this was. To us, it's normal, right? This is the way things are supposed to be. But man, go back 40 or 50, 60 years ago. This was new stuff. This was radical. It was as radical to them as this kind of lockdown is to us. Um, and fears about government overstepping, and a lot of what we're hearing right now, it's a totally different issue, but it really is kind of similar in some ways. So just some things to think about. You're on your, I don't think I said this yet, but on your stream, I'm going to remind you that you have a link with password to issues and controversy. I think I did say that before, actually, but I'll put it on the stream. And just to remind you that that's a good resource for you to use to answer your questions. I hope you're hanging in there, and trying to make the most of this. I miss everybody. I told you I'd say that every time. I will, because I really do. I was in my classroom. I had to run in and grab a textbook the other day, and it was so empty in there. But it was, they are cleaning the building real well, and our custodians are doing a great job. So, and actually, everybody's working real hard, just so you know, all your teachers, and I'm really proud to say I'm a member of the faculty, our superintendent, our principal, they're all really working hard. And we care about you, and we hope that you can make the most of this time, and that this weather keeps getting better and warmer, and that you can get outside and maybe see each other before the end of the school year. But hang in there, and we'll talk to you again virtually this week. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. All right? Take care.